Before becoming the face of the renowned grill bearing his name and a two-time heavyweight champion, George Foreman was just a young man trying to make it through the slums of Houston. But he didn't just make it. Foreman created one of the most amazing lives in sports history by overcoming obstacles with his fists, faith, and unwavering spirit. But beneath the success and smiles was a man who faced demons that few ever witnessed. And when he died this isn't simply the story of a boxer. It's the story of a man who, at the age of 76, left behind a huge wealth that was meticulously planned with love and personal letters that brought his children to tears. This is the unsung tale of George Foreman's final greatest gift. The story of the man who came from little, lost everything, rebuilt everything, and left behind a legacy far richer than money could measure. Foreman's narrative didn't start with dazzling lights or championship belts. It started in the harsh slums of Houston's Fifth Ward. George was born on January 10, 1949, and was the fifth of 7 children in a family that battled daily to support his biological. As a child, George was irate, destitute, harassed, and frequently in trouble because his father, Leroy Moorhead, was absent and his mother, Nancy Foreman, married a guy named J.D. Foreman, who attempted to support the family on a janitor's salary, wandered the streets, and battled anyone who looked at him incorrectly. To him, school meant nothing. Food was frequently a luxury. Shoes didn't always fit. And by the time he was a teenager, survival wasn't a game, but rather a matter of life and death. As a teenager, George had already begun to take risks, stealing, fighting, and fantasizing of escaping. One night, while he was evading the police, he realized that if he didn't change, he would either die or be left behind. At the age of 16, Bars's despair forced him to enlist in the Job Corps, a federal program created to teach disturbed youngsters trades and build futures. It was in Oregon that George discovered his purpose. Doc Brous Foreman, his boxing mentor, formed Foreman not only as a boxer, but also as a man by instilling in him a sense of discipline, purpose, and strength. Foreman rapidly displayed raw, intimidating power. He wasn't polished, but he was unusually strong. George accepted a new dream, the Olympics, like a lifeline. He trained non-stop, changing his life day by day, punch after punch, and when he entered the ring for the 1968 Mexico City Olympics, he carried not just his own aspirations, but the aspirations of all the forgotten children back home. Foreman used unbridled anger and tremendous force to win the gold medal, and when he stood on the podium waving, the world saw a potential champion in the little American flag, but George saw more evidence that a kid from the gutter could grow up to be a man the world had to respect. Little did he know that the struggle to stay on top would be equally fierce. George Foreman, who turned professional after winning the Olympics, not only won but also dominated, amassing an unblemished record from 1969 to 1973 and destroying opponents with deafening. Every punch was a statement, and George Foreman was more than just another fighter. He was a force of nature. The money began to pour in, and promoters, fans, and networks all adored him. This was Foreman's first major championship. Payday came in 1973 when he challenged Joe Frazier for the world heavyweight title. Unbeaten and fierce, Frazier was supposed to defend his title, but Foreman destroyed him in 2 vicious rounds, knocking him down 6. Foreman went from being a roughneck fighter to a rich sensation overnight after one of the most significant title victories in history. Fancy outfits, flashy cars, and opulent homes were all part of the new. Everyone knew that he had succeeded. But Foreman didn't enjoy the recognition. He wasn't Ali, who had a sharp tongue and sparkling charm. Instead, George was more reserved, quiet, and angry. And as the money accumulated, so did the loneliness. He once acknowledged that he felt lonely as he became wealthier, and realized that many people around him were more concerned with his pocketbook than his health. Yet Foreman persisted and defended his championship with fearsome, efficiency-crushing opponents like Ken Norton and Jose Roman. But the real test came in 1974 when he faced Muhammad Ali in the Rumble in the Jungle, a bout that would define him for better or worse. Foreman entered the fight as Ali, the overwhelming favorite and invincible juggernaut, had other ideas. Using the now famous rope tactic, he let Foreman pound himself out before knocking him out in the 8th. Not only did Foreman lose the title, but he also lost his aura of invincibility. Suddenly, George was no longer the unstoppable monster. Instead, he was vulnerable. And that vulnerability allowed the door to after Ali George Foreman's career and life collapsed into disarray due to a completely other type of war, one that would almost cost him everything. The millions he had made didn't buy serenity, the houses though. He went on, winning some fights, losing others. But the fire wasn't the same as his rage, and the motor that had drove his domination started to fail. Cars, jewelry, and everything else didn't make up for the emptiness left by that one terrible night in Zaire. Consume him. In 1977, following a startling loss to Jimmy Young in Puerto Rico, his friends noted that he had become erratic, lashing out, retreating, and plunging into a deep depression that no amount of money could solve. Foreman fainted after staggering back to his dressing room, fatigued and dehydrated. He later characterized what transpired as a full-blown near-death experience, claiming that he felt himself dying rather than fainting. When Foreman recovered, he begged for another chance at life, vowing to devote his life to religion rather than fame after descending into darkness and then experiencing glimpses of God's love and forgiveness. Without hesitation, his consciousness was altered, and he gave up boxing. There was no goodbye tour or final salary, just stillness for the next 10 years. George Foreman became an ordained priest, He spent years trying to make amends for his youthful transgressions while living humbly, nearly impoverished, in a Houston Church of the Lord Jesus Christ, where he preached to anybody who would listen, sometimes to empty seats. Giving back to the community by providing food for the underprivileged and refuge for the homeless, but financial difficulties threatened. His fortune vanished due to poor financial management, poor investments, and the high expense of maintaining his ministries afloat by the mid-1980s. George Foreman, formerly the world's richest fighter, was broke. He didn't sue or complain, he just continued to preach and smile, but his family needed more since his kids were growing up. George Foreman, who was almost 40 years old, decided it was time to fight again, not for glory or retribution, but for survival, when he revealed that his bills were getting out of control. When he made his comeback in 1987, the majority of the boxing community laughed since he was overweight, close to 40, and hadn't competed in more than 10 years. Reporters made fun of him, fans jeered, and promoters weren't sure if anyone would even come to watch him fight. Foreman came to the ring with almost 270 pounds on his body, a long cry from the torn juggernaut who had terrorized, and he didn't care about the commotion. He wasn't chasing headlines. Instead, he was chasing stability for his family, the heavyweight class. But he embraced the image of the amiable, obese man who was still capable of delivering a vicious blow. He was aware that his physical attributes had changed, but he had an advantage over many of his younger rivals. Didn't have heart and an unwavering will, George swept through journeymen and underdogs to win fight after fight, gradually moving up the rankings. However, it wasn't simply the wins that made people fall in love with George. It was George Foreman's attitude vanished, and he was no longer the stoic, scary guy of the 1970s. He became a media favorite by making jokes, grinning, and making fun of his own weight could coexist. The ascent reached its climax in 1994 when Foreman, then 45, faced Michael Moore for the heavyweight title. At the time, Moira was 19 years younger, unbeaten, and significantly favored after 9 rounds. In the 10th round, Foreman landed a right shot that changed everything. He was outboxed, taking punches but remaining composed, and the referee counted him out. Against all odds, Foreman became the oldest. In addition to being a personal triumph, the heavyweight champion's moment was a victory for all underdogs who had ever been told they were too old, too damaged, or too far gone. The Foreman sank to his knees in silence. With that belt came something more significant than financial security and bragging rights. But George wasn't done constructing. His biggest financial move was still to come. His damaged hands were still covered in history, wouldn't take place inside the ring. George Foreman had accomplished something that few athletes ever do, a second peak. However, even he understood that boxing couldn't endure forever, so when the chance arose in the mid-1990s, Foreman was asked to endorse a new product, a fat-reducing electric grill, in an unexpected way by George. At first, it seemed absurd that a heavyweight champion would support a household gadget. However, Foreman noticed something that no one else did. He realized that Americans enjoyed 2 things: flavorful food, and feeling better. If he, a hugely endearing past champion, could promote the idea of grilling lean meals, it might just George's natural charisma and relatability made the difference. He didn't pretend to be a cook. Instead, he informed the world that he loved burgers and that this grill made them great. Work wasn't an immediate success, and the early infomercials were awkward. Sales of the George Foreman grill skyrocketed by the early 2000s, with over 100 million grills sold globally, thanks to Foreman's healthy lifestyle, hearty laugh, wide smile, and unquestionable sincerity. It was ingenious that he negotiated a portion of the revenues rather than a one-time endorsement fee. By the time Sultan in Canaan, the company that owned the grill, purchased his rights in 1999, Foreman left with an estimated in contrast to his first windfall, which had eluded him. George was astute this time and made an investment that changed his family's future. The $138 million payday, which was more than he had ever earned from boxing the grill, did more than simply boost his bank account. Real estate, established trusts, and broadened his holdings. The George Foreman grill served as the foundation for an empire that transcended boxing, stardom, and the realm of American commerce. Not only a rich man, but also one of the few athletes who had actually overcome financial obstacles. Yet even as his riches increased, George never lost sight of his roots or the people he was fighting for behind the smile, the celebrity, and the fortune. The most essential item in George Foreman's public persona was his family. He had 12 children, 5 sons, all of whom were notably called George, and 7 daughters. His family wasn't just significant. It was everything when he had promised his children, who were young and impoverished, that if he ever succeeded, they would never have to endure the life he had. No more hunger, no more dread, no more nights of wondering if the lights would stay on. Foreman kept his promise. Riches to provide a safety net for his family, purchasing homes for them, funding their college education, and helping them start their own companies and careers. However, it wasn't only about providing them with financial support. It was also about giving. Despite his hectic schedule, George was quite involved in their lives. He once stated in an interview that, "Money can't raise your kids, you've got to be there." Whenever feasible, he attended family dinners, athletic events, and school plays. He wasn't simply a giver, he was a presence. He also made sure his wealth was secure by setting up a number of trusts to make sure that after his death, his wealth would be dispersed sensibly and equitably, and his aim was straightforward. No conflict, no court cases, no media attention, just a family remaining united as he had always desired. Each of his children received a letter. George personally wrote personal letters that were full of love, wisdom, and memories. Instead of discussing money, he talked about faith, tenacity, kindness, and what it meant to bear the Foreman name. By the time George Foreman passed away, he had not only ensured his family's financial future, but also laid a foundation for them. That was more resilient than any bank account. As we will soon discover when the last chapter of his life begins, he was proud and humble. As the years passed, even George Foreman's unbreakable frame started to show signs of wear brought on by decades of neglect. It wasn't the millions that caused his children to cry, but rather the guy who gave them everything who really left the largest hole. He had numerous surgeries for hip replacements, knee replacements, and other injuries after being punished in the boxing arena by fighters like Joe Frazier, Muhammad Ali, Ron Lyle, and innumerable more. Chronic back discomfort became a daily hardship due to surgeries and procedures to correct residual damage from previous accidents. And his hands, which were previously recognized for throwing the most devastating punches in heavyweight history, became swollen and rigid. He made light of his arthritis in interviews, but his close friends knew it was serious business. Foreman's physical suffering wasn't the only thing holding him back. He also struggled with his emotions, not only spiritually but physically. Although he kept the most of the information confidential, there were rumors in the early 2000s and 2010s that he had been diagnosed with cardiac issues as a result of years of physical strain and significant weight changes over his career. According to those close to him, Foreman was quietly getting ready for the next stage of his life, when fighting was no longer a possibility. Public appearances also decreased, and the lengthy media tours and meet and greets were no longer an option. When he did show up, whether for charity events or boxing matches, he walked more slowly, relied more on family, and frequently required medical assistance nearby. But George never grumbled and instead grew more devout. Family and into ordinary pleasure days, fishing, taking care of his ranch, throwing Sunday barbecues, and remembering the time when he was the heavyweight champion. However, many people were unaware that behind the in addition to maintaining a calm public image, George worked non-stop to ensure that everything was prepared for his departure. He spent hours ensuring that there would be no uncertainty following his departure. Court fight. There was no resentment among his heirs. He understood that his time was short, and like George Foreman in the ring, he didn't intend to leave anything undone. The news came as a shock in early 2025. Following a catastrophic health issue, fans flooded social media with prayers and tributes to the iconic champion, who was first reported to be in critical condition and under careful medical observation. Foreman's family stayed relatively silent and released a single statement, asking for solitude and prayers during this time. Millions of ordinary people and boxing greats held their breath waiting for updates that never seemed to arrive. After a very trying period, George Foreman died quietly at his Texas ranch on March 9, 2025, surrounded by his family. He was 76 years old, and his passing shocked people all across the world. News sources carried tributes to him. Even non-boxing celebrities, such as actresses, musicians, and politicians, took the time to pay tribute to the giant who had evolved into so much. More than just a boxer, fighters like Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield, Lennox Lewis, and Deontay Wilder offered heartfelt remarks. Boxer. But inside the Foreman family home, a much more private scene unfolded as George's children, grandchildren, and closest friends came together to honor the life of the fighter, rather than just mourn him. At the small private funeral service, there were no fireworks or a huge public spectacle, which was George's idea. He had specifically asked for a humble, basic memorial service. They had known the guy not as the champ, but simply as dad, grandpa, and friend. At the ceremony, his eldest son read passages from letters George had written to each of his children, words that would soon move the entire family to tears. The letters were full of stories, humor, faith, and family. He gave life lessons on gratitude, humility, honesty, faith, and love, instead of giving instructions on how to spend the fortune he left behind. George Foreman had struck harder than any man living, and he even hit a man who was dead. Difficult, but this time directly to the heart, the Foreman family was ready for the fundamentals: inheritances, trusts, and allocations, when they came down with lawyers to hear the reading of the will. However, they weren't ready for the estimates of George Foreman's estate's value showed that it was well over $300 million, which was derived from both boxing purses and the royalties from the George Foreman Grill, smart real estate. The personal touches George left for each of his children along the way were even more impressive than the investments made in Texas and California, endorsement deals, book royalties, and a well-managed licensing empire. Each child received a handwritten letter from their father along with their cash inheritances, outlining the lessons he wished them to remember most. His father didn't boast about his wealth or titles. George III sobbed as he read the last words of his speech, which focused on character, dignity, family, and the idea that true richness in life isn't measured in money, but rather in the love you leave behind for one kid, Georgetta cried as she conveyed her father's advice. Even the solicitors, who are hardened professionals used to fighting for renown, should strive for kindness. The words of his father's letter, "You have my name," mean something else. Handling Chile court cases reported that they were crying. When they, although tangible wealth was enormous, it was the love's emotional wealth direction and George Foreman's pride abandoned that genuinely made his family weep. He hadn't just made a fortune, has created a household more resilient than